In the popular imagination, the frontier is associated with open prairies and cowboy myths. The historical reality, however, was concentrated in a different space. The real drama of the frontier unfolded within four walls made of logs and clay. A hut is not a house in the modern sense. It is a life support system in a hostile environment, and this system had its own ruthless operating instructions. Every creak of a log, every wisp of smoke from the hearth, every draft was not a trivial detail of everyday life. These were lessons, harsh lessons in physics, chemistry, and psychology. 9 fundamental laws of life in a confined space, where a mistaken protocol meant system failure, and system failure meant the death of the operator. Watch the video to the end, and you will find out what forgotten rules were dictated by the very logic of the log cabin. What knowledge was the only guarantee that its walls would remain a shelter and not turn into a tomb. The construction of the hut was not an act of building, but the creation of an airtight capsule for survival. The fundamental principle was not to produce heat, but to retain it obsessively. The choice of material was the first step in this protocol. Massive logs of coniferous species, pine or spruce, with a diameter of at least 30-40 centimeters were used. This thickness served not only as insulation, but also as a heat accumulator. During the day, even in conditions of weak sunlight, the dense wood slowly accumulated energy from the hearth. At night, it released it just as slowly, smoothing out temperature drops and preventing sudden cooling. This phenomenon is known as thermal inertia, and it was the main ally in the fight against the cold. However, the thermal mass of the logs alone was useless without a second component, the ideal geometry of the joints. The corner joints, made using saddle notch or dovetail technology, were fitted with minimal gaps. Each log was laid so that, under its own weight, it fit as tightly as possible to the one below, creating a primary seal. This was the work of a perfectionist carpenter, where millimeters mattered. But even perfect cutting did not guarantee tightness. The key to survival was secondary sealing, caulking. Gaps are the main enemy, a loophole for chaos. A composite material was used to fill them: moss, sphagnum, clay, and a reinforcing component, dry grass or even animal wool. Clay without reinforcement cracked when it dried, becoming useless. Moss provided elasticity. This process was continuous. The log cabin breathed and settled during the first year, and every crack had to be regularly inspected and resealed. Quality control was not visual, but acoustic. On a windy day, there should be absolute, almost deafening silence inside a completely caulked hut. Any whistle, any barely audible hum meant a leak. A leak meant convective heat loss, a direct and quick path to frostbite while sleeping. An experienced settler could point to the spot on the wall where the siphon was with his eyes closed, simply by the change in the tone of the sound. The sound of wind inside the hut was not just uncomfortable, it was an alarm signal, an indicator of a failure in the life support system. Psychologically, complete silence meant safety and total control over one's microcosm. The howling of the wind inside was an invasion of external chaos, the beginning of the end. Modern people are accustomed to background noise. Here, however, silence was the highest engineering achievement and the only lullaby. Have you heard of similar methods of assessing airtightness, perhaps in old village houses or in stories told by older generations? Write in the comments and where you are watching us from. Would modern people be able to ensure absolute silence in their homes if their lives depended on it? We are interested in your opinion. Meat was the currency of survival, fuel for the body. But without refrigeration, this currency was extremely unstable. From the moment of harvest, the countdown began, and the war with an invisible enemy, an army of microorganisms, began. Salting and drying are well-known methods, but salt was a scarce and expensive resource on the frontier, valued almost as much as gunpowder. Therefore, survival depended on deeper biochemical knowledge. The key method was chemical warfare based on controlling the pH level. Decay bacteria cannot multiply in extremely alkaline or acidic environments. To create an alkaline environment, meat was soaked in a lye solution. It was obtained in a makeshift manner. A filter was made from straw and stones in a barrel without a bottom or in a woven box. Sifted ash from burnt deciduous trees, coniferous ash was less effective, was poured in and water was slowly poured through it. The concentration of the solution was determined using an old method. A raw potato or egg thrown into it should float. This process essentially triggered a slight hydrolysis of fats on the surface of the meat, forming fatty acid salts, a primitive soap. This thin film was destructive to microorganisms. The smoking process was not so much culinary as it was sterilization. It was divided into cold and hot smoking. Hot smoking was for quick cooking. Cold smoking, at a temperature of 20-25 degrees, was for preservation. The process could last from several days to weeks. Smoke from hardwoods, oak, alder, hickory, saturated the meat with phenols, creosote, and aldehydes. These substances are powerful antiseptics and antioxidants. They did not simply dehydrate the meat, but impregnated it thoroughly, creating a chemical barrier impervious to bacteria and mold. The choice of wood was critical. Smoke from pine or spruce contained too much resin and gave the product a bitter, inedible taste. But what happened when a mistake in proportions turned the only food supply into a caustic, toxic substance? The line between preservative and poison was incredibly thin, and the price of such a chemical miscalculation in the middle of winter was absolute and fatal. Frontier medicine had nothing to do with healing in the modern sense. It was applied pharmacognosy, the science of medicinal products combined with a strict risk assessment protocol. The human body was the most important but also the most fragile tool, and it couldn't be replaced. Any damage, even minor trauma, could quickly lead to complete system failure. Therefore, knowledge of the properties of surrounding plants was not a hobby, but an essential part of maintaining the main asset. At the same time, a mistake in identifying a plant was as fatal as the disease itself. The main liquid bandage in antiseptic was pine resin, a sap. It was collected from tree trunks and stored in an airtight container. To apply it to a wound, the resin was often slightly warmed to make it more pliable. Upon contact with the skin, volatile terpenes with moderate bactericidal properties began to evaporate, and the resin itself polymerized in the air. It created an elastic, waterproof, and breathable film that not only isolated the damaged area, but also pulled the edges of the wound together. To remove splinters or other foreign bodies, the sap was mixed with crushed charcoal to form a pulling ointment that worked on the principle of osmosis. For internal use as an anti-inflammatory and antipyretic agent, a decoction of the inner layer of willow bark, cambium, was used. It contains salicin, a natural glycoside that is metabolized in the human body into salicylic acid, an analog of aspirin. The decoction had an extremely bitter taste, which served as both an indicator of its potency and a natural dosage limiter. This knowledge was widespread among indigenous peoples and became one of the most important borrowings. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, known as soldier's wound herb, was the #1 astringent and hemostatic agent. Its fresh leaves were rubbed between the fingers until juice was released and applied directly to the wound. The alkaloids and flavonoids it contains promoted rapid capillary spasm and blood clotting. Oak bark decoctions were used to treat weeping surfaces and as an anti-diarrheal agent. Their effectiveness was due to their high tannin content. The chemical principle of tannins is protein precipitation. This property not only allowed the skin to be tanned, but also dried the tissues, creating a protective film on their surface. Plantain, Plantago major, was used for bites or to relieve local inflammation. Its leaves were chewed into a paste and applied to the affected area. The aucubin it contains has proven anti-inflammatory properties. This knowledge was strictly utilitarian. There was no mysticism involved. It was pure chemistry and botany. The forest was not just a source of wood, but a pharmacy and warehouse of materials, where every tree and every bush was seen as a potential resource for repair, treatment, or survival. The fire in the hearth was not just a source of light and heat, it was the central processor of the hut's life support system, and its accidental shutdown was tantamount to death. Matches were a rare luxury. The standard kit for kindling, flint, steel, and tinder, required skill and absolutely dry materials. Therefore, the main tactical task was not to light a fire, but to keep it going. The key to this was fuel logistics, which began long before winter. The wood had to be cut and left to dry for at least 6 months. Wet wood produced little heat, a lot of smoke, and dangerous creosote. The fire operator had to be knowledgeable about the grades of wood. Hardwoods, oak, maple, burned slowly, hotly, and produced long smoldering embers, the ideal fuel for heating. Soft coniferous woods, pine, spruce, burned quickly but heavily polluted the chimney. The chimney itself often posed the greatest danger. Made of clay-coated sticks, it quickly accumulated creosote, a highly flammable, resinous substance, on its walls. A soot fire in the chimney was equivalent to a fire that could destroy a hut in minutes. Therefore, regular cleaning of the chimney, usually with a bundle of fir branches tied to a rope, was a mandatory procedure. To keep the fire burning through the night, there was a system of fire preservation. The largest coals from hard rocks were raked into the center of the hearth. This living core was tightly covered with ash, which, being an insulator, sharply slowed down the oxidation process, switching combustion to anaerobic smoldering. In the morning, hand bellows were used. This simple tool was an ignition system that allowed a precise jet of oxygen to be directed at the smoldering coals and start the fire without the need for precious tinder. This method required enormous experience. The operator had to take everything into account: the type of wood, its moisture content, the size of the coals, and even the draft in the chimney, which depended on the direction of the wind. He was, in essence, the living automation of a long-burning solid fuel boiler. What was the price of a mistake if the coals were cold in the morning and a blizzard was raging outside at -30 degrees? It was expressed in a desperate struggle with freezing, unresponsive fingers, trying to hold the icy flint and strike a spark on the tinder damp from breath. The answer was clear and required no discussion. The only driving force on the frontier was human muscle power, a low-efficiency motor with low torque that consumed the most valuable fuel: calories. The only amplifier of this force was hand tools: axes, knives, saws, wedges. Their effectiveness was not a matter of brute force, but of a precise understanding of applied physics. The wrong tool or technique meant not just fatigue, but a waste of energy that could be crucial for survival. The axe was the main tool. Its geometry was strictly functional. The felling axe had a relatively thin blade and narrow cheeks, head profile, to penetrate deep across the wood fibers. The splitting maul was essentially a heavy wedge with massive, diverging cheeks. Its purpose was not to chop, but to tear the fibers lengthwise. The handle, made of strong and resilient hickory or ash, was not just a stick. Its length and curvature were calculated so that when swung, the axe head moved in an optimal arc, maximizing centrifugal force and kinetic energy at the point of impact. A two-handed crosscut saw, often called a misery whip, was used for cutting large logs. Its effectiveness depended on the complex geometry of the teeth. In addition to the cutting teeth, it had special, shorter, raking teeth designed to remove sawdust from the kerf. Without properly adjusted raker teeth, the saw would instantly jam and get stuck in the wood. When felling a tree, a system of two cuts was used: a guide cut, wedge cut, and a main cut. The precise location and depth of these cuts determined the trajectory of the trunk's fall. For particularly large trees, steel or wooden wedges were used to prevent the saw from jamming and to direct the fall accurately. These were driven into the main kerf, creating enormous internal tension in the trunk. This was work that required precise calculation and a cool head. A mistake could lead to the tool jamming, the tree falling in the wrong direction, or, in the worst case, injury. The tools required constant maintenance, which was a separate discipline. The saw blade had to be regularly sharpened and set with a special tool, a setting tool, bending the teeth to the sides at a strictly defined angle. This created a cut wider than the blade itself, preventing it from jamming. The blade of the axe, sharpened on a whetstone, could not be overheated. This led to tempering of the metal, making the hardened steel soft and useless. The axe handle had to be correctly fitted and wedged so that the heavy blade would not come off when struck. The breakdown of a key tool hundreds of kilometers from the nearest smithy was not an inconvenience, but a systemic failure. A broken axe handle in the middle of a winter forest, far from a hut, presented a person with a choice: abandon the priceless metal axe head or risk deadly hypothermia on the way back. It was an accident that could instantly wipe out all chances of survival. Cabin fever is not a figment of the imagination. It is a clinical condition caused by prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and lack of social contact. Winter on the frontier lasted for months. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the howling of the wind, and their own breathing. The only colors were the white snow outside the window and the dark walls of the hut. In such conditions, deprived of its usual stimulation, the brain begins to malfunction. Cognitive distortions arise, anxiety and paranoia increase. The monotony of daily life, stoking the fire, cooking, repairing tools, becomes a ritual, the violation of which causes irrational fear. People begin to hear footsteps in the snow and see movement at the periphery of their vision. This is a protective mechanism of the psyche, trying to create events where there are none. It was critical for survival to maintain mental discipline. Some kept primitive diaries, carving notches on the walls to keep track of the days. Others talked to themselves, not out of madness, but to maintain speech functions. Work was the most important stabilizing factor. Any meaningful activity that required concentration distracted the brain from self-destruction. How could a person trust their own mind when their only companion for months was the crackling of the fire in the hearth? This question remained the main challenge after all the technical problems had been solved. Life on the frontier was governed not by the clock, but by the annual cycle. It was not simply a matter of following the seasons, but rather strict resource planning, where each month had its own strategic purpose. The season began in spring. The main task was hunting and fishing to replenish protein reserves depleted over the winter. The first edible plants were gathered. The land was prepared if farming was planned. Huts were repaired after winter damage. The main period of construction and harvesting was summer, cutting down trees to expand buildings or for firewood, gathering berries, mushrooms, roots, and preserving them, drying, curing. This was the time of maximum activity when daylight hours were used to the fullest. The critical stage of their life came in the fall. Final preparation of firewood for the winter. The norm was at least 10 or 15 cubic meters of tightly packed wood. Mass hunting and salting of meat, harvesting if there was any, checking and final caulking of the hut. Stocking up on everything that might be needed, from salt to material for repairing clothes. In winter, a specific survival mode was activated. Minimal activity outside the hut. The main tasks were maintaining the fire, repairing tools and clothing, and making utensils. Resource consumption was strictly controlled. Any unexpected expenditure could lead to a shortage by the end of winter. This cycle was the law. Violating it due to illness, injury, or laziness meant that a person would be unprepared for the next critical stage, and nature did not forgive unpreparedness. Water is a resource more important than food. The choice of a location for a hut was 90% determined by the availability of a reliable source of water, but it was not always possible to settle directly on a river or stream. In this case, knowledge that could be called applied geology came into play. Settlers learned to read the landscape. Clusters of moisture-loving plants, such as willow or alder, in low-lying areas almost always indicated the presence of groundwater nearby. Observing animal trails could also lead to a source. Animals instinctively know where to look for water. If there was no open source, a well was dug. This was laborious work. The walls of the shaft were reinforced with logs or wattle to prevent collapse. The quality of the water was assessed organoleptically by color, smell, and taste. Cloudy water or water with a swampy smell was considered dangerous and required boiling or filtration. The simplest filter was made of several layers. A layer of grass was placed in a bucket or barrel with holes in the bottom, then coarse river sand, then crushed charcoal from a fire, and then sand again. The charcoal served as an adsorbent, absorbing some of the organic impurities. The effectiveness was limited, but it was better than nothing. Boiling remained the most reliable method. In a world without hardware stores, every available resource was reimagined. It was intuitive materials science. Rawhide was a versatile material. Unlike tanned leather, it shrunk when dried and became extremely hard. It was wrapped around cracked tool handles to create a strong bandage. It was used to make ropes, belts, and door loops. Animal sinew, dried and split into fibers, served as thread. When wet, it became elastic, and after drying, it shrunk, creating a very strong and tight seam that was used in sewing clothing, from skins and repairing shoes. Clay was not just a building material. Mixed with grass or animal hair as a reinforcing fiber, it became a durable composite for coating hearths and chimneys, reducing their fire hazard. Primitive pottery was made from pure clay. Even the bladders of large animals were put to use. Dried, they served as translucent, waterproof membranes for windows, allowing a little light into the hut, or as flasks for carrying water. It was a closed-loop economy with no waste. Every part of a slaughtered animal or felled tree had a purpose. These 9 lessons are only a small part of the vast system of knowledge that allowed people to survive on the frontier. It was not an adventure. It was work. Hard, methodical, and unforgiving. Heroism did not lie in gunfights, but in the ability to live another day by stoking the fire and checking supplies. The reality of the frontier was devoid of romance. It was filled with the physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology of survival. Perhaps the most important lesson is that when deprived of technology, humans are forced to become technology themselves. A complex, adaptive, and incredibly efficient system. Which of these practices and lessons do you think remain relevant today, in a world where all risks seem to have been eliminated and survival is guaranteed at the push of a button? How did you feel when you heard about this reality? We read all comments. If you are interested in such an in-depth and unbiased look at history, subscribe to our channel. There are many more topics ahead, free of myths.